The crowded terminal of the international airport buzzed with the chaos of rolling suitcases boarding announcements, and the faint scent of roasted coffee drifting from the cafe nearby. Elena Hart, 26 years old, sat near gate 34 clutching a weathered carry-on that had seen better days. Her shoulders curved inward as if she were trying to fold herself small enough to disappear among the throngs of travelers. Her jeans were faded, her sweater a hand-me-down, yet her eyes carried a quiet determination that spoke of years spent surviving in silence rather than being celebrated. She was simply waiting for her evening flight, nothing more, nothing less. At least that was what she thought. Out of nowhere, laughter pierced the constant murmur of the terminal. Elena froze. She knew that voice. Jason, the man she once believed she would spend forever with, strode confidently toward her with a tall brunette clinging to his arm. The woman's dress shimmered like liquid silver under the fluorescent lights, while Jason's tailored suit screamed success and wealth. He spotted Elena paused, and a smirk curled on his lips. His eyes flicked up and down her simple outfit before he delivered the dagger. Still the same little nobody, huh? His voice carried just enough volume for people nearby to glance up. Elena's cheeks burned crimson. It felt as if the air had been knocked out of her chest. Memories of the years she had given him, the sacrifices she had made, the nights spent believing in a future that never came, all collapsed in a single moment under his cruel gaze. Her hands trembled as humiliation wrapped around her like a choking vine. Jason's new girlfriend let out a delicate laugh, clearly enjoying the spectacle of Elena squirming. In the pit of despair and shame, Elena's eyes darted desperately for escape. That was when she noticed the man sitting one seat away, tall and broad-shouldered, absorbed in reading something on his phone. Without thinking, fueled by instinct alone, she leaned slightly toward him and whispered in a voice that trembled but carried a spark of defiance, "Pretend to hug me, please." The man lifted his eyes. They were a striking shade of gray calm, yet commanding. For a heartbeat, Elena feared he would ignore her, leaving her to drown in Jason's mockery. Instead, with a single fluid movement, he slipped his arm around her shoulders and pulled her gently against his chest. The warmth of his embrace startled her, as did the faint scent of cedar and leather that clung to his jacket. Jason's smirk faltered, his words stuck halfway out of his throat. The brunette beside him blinked, clearly caught off guard. Elena barely dared to breathe, her heart hammering so hard she thought the stranger might feel it through his shirt. The transformation of the atmosphere was immediate. Nearby travelers paused mid-stride, some lifting their phones to capture the surprising tableau. In the blink of an eye, the shy young woman with the worn-out suitcase was no longer invisible. She was in the arms of a man whose presence radiated quiet authority, as if he were born to command any room he entered. Elena could not know that this single impulsive request would ignite a chain of events spiraling far beyond her control. Nor could she imagine that the stranger holding her now was Alexander Kane, a reclusive billionaire whose decisions shaped the very airline industry that carried them. For now, all she knew was that in the face of Jason's cruel laughter, she was no longer standing alone. Elena sat stiffly in the circle of his arm, her mind racing with panic and disbelief. She had not thought through what she was doing. She had simply reacted, clutching at the first lifeline she could find in the storm of Jason's mockery. Yet the stranger beside her had responded with such calm certainty, as though stepping into a role he had been rehearsing his entire life. His grip was not possessive, but steady, protective in a way that startled her more than the cruelty of Jason's words. As Jason and his glittering companion shifted uncomfortably, Elena realized that the balance of power in this small social collision had shifted entirely. The woman who had moments ago laughed at her now fidgeted with her clutch, her eyes darting between Jason's faltering smirk and the tall man whose arm rested casually around Elena's shoulders. Jason's throat bobbed as he swallowed clearly, unsure of his next move. He tried to recover, forcing a brittle laugh. "So, Elena, who is this?" His tone was mocking, but the edge of insecurity had crept into his words. Elena opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her pulse thundered, her tongue tied in knots. Before she could stammer something awkward, the stranger spoke with measured ease, his voice deep and deliberate, carrying a quiet authority that silenced the noise around them. Her boyfriend. 2 words spoken without hesitation carved the air like a blade. Jason's expression collapsed into stunned silence, his arrogance shaken by the casual declaration. The brunette on his arm blinked rapidly, clearly unprepared for the shift in dynamics. Elena's heart lurched violently in her chest. Heat rushed into her cheeks, and for a terrifying second, she wondered if she should deny it, correct the lie, explain herself. But when she looked up at the stranger, his eyes steadied her. There was no smirk, no mockery in his face, only a calm, protective resolve, as if he were telling her without words that she could lean on him, that she was safe in this moment. Jason sputtered, trying to regain control of the situation. "Well, congratulations," he sneered, his smile brittle. "You managed to trade up after all." His attempt at sarcasm landed poorly. The brunette tightened her grip on his arm, tugging at him, as if to steer him away from a battle he was rapidly losing. Jason's pride, however, would not allow him to retreat. He stepped closer, his voice dropping, so only Elena and the stranger could hear. "Funny you never mentioned him." Elena's breath caught. Shame threatened to overwhelm her, but the stranger responded smoothly before she could crumble. "Maybe she did not think you deserved to know," he said coolly, his gaze never leaving Jason's face. Jason's jaw clenched, the muscles twitching as his mask of superiority cracked. With a frustrated huff, he turned sharply, dragging his companion with him. They disappeared into the bustling crowd, but not before Jason shot Elena one final glare. A glare that promised he would not forget this humiliation. Elena sat frozen, her body rigid against the warmth of the stranger's embrace. She felt as though she had stepped into a story she did not belong to. Slowly he released her, the absence of his arm leaving her cold and unmoored. She stared down at her hands, struggling to find words. "Thank you." She finally whispered, her voice so soft she wondered if he even heard it. He set his phone aside and leaned slightly toward her, his gray eyes steady. "You looked like you needed saving." The simplicity of his response left her momentarily speechless. Most men she had encountered would have mocked her desperation or taken advantage of the situation. But his tone carried no judgment, only a calm acknowledgement of what had just happened. Elena dared a closer look at him. His features were sharp, yet composed, the kind of face that drew second glances without ever demanding attention. His hair was dark, swept neatly back, yet slightly tousled, as though he had run a hand through it too many times. His suit was understated charcoal with a subtle sheen, the kind of fabric that whispered of wealth to those who knew how to recognize it. Yet he did not wear the suit in the way Jason always had, flaunting it like armor. He wore it as if it were simply what he had put on that morning, a second skin he neither noticed nor cared about. Elena's mind tried to place him. A businessman, perhaps, or an executive. Definitely someone successful. But he did not match the flashy image of men jollier Jason had always idolized. This man radiated something quieter, steadier, more dangerous. Still to her, he was simply a stranger who had shown unexpected kindness. "I am Elena," she managed, offering a tentative smile. His lips curved in the faintest echo of a smile. "Alexander." She repeated the name silently, letting it settle in her memory. Alexander, strong, old-fashioned a name that belonged to someone who carved his own path. She wanted to ask more to understand why he had stepped in, but her courage faltered. He did not seem eager to explain himself, either, his attention, drifting momentarily back to his phone. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but charged with an awareness that something significant had just occurred. Elena's thoughts drifted. She remembered every time Jason had mocked her dreams, of teaching every dismissive laugh when she spoke of wanting to build a small life filled with meaning rather than money. She remembered how he had abandoned her for someone whose father owned a string of luxury hotels. She had believed his cruel words today because they echoed what she already feared about herself, that she was invisible, ordinary, a nobody. Yet sitting beside Alexander, she felt the first flicker of something different. He had not looked at her with pity. He had not laughed. He had simply stood between her and humiliation, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She studied him out of the corner of her eye, wondering who exactly he was. The way he spoke carried confidence, but not the arrogance of Jason. The way he looked at Jason had been filled with an authority that came from a place Jason would never understand. Jason thrived on appearances, but this man's power seemed deeper rooted in something that did not need to be flaunted. Elena could not explain why, but she sensed that her life had just collided with someone extraordinary. She just did not know yet how extraordinary. The boarding call echoed through the terminal, and Elena felt a shiver of dread when she realized Jason and his girlfriend were walking toward the same gate. Fate was cruel enough to trap them on the same flight. She wanted nothing more than to vanish into the crowd, but Alexander rose beside her with quiet composure, his hand brushing her elbow in a gesture that felt both protective and authoritative. As they joined the line to board, Jason glanced back, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Alexander still by her side. The brunette whispered something in his ear, her lips twisted in a smug smile, and Jason chuckled as though the game had just begun. Elena's stomach churned. She told herself that once the plane landed, this strange performance would be over, that she could return to her quiet life and forget the burning humiliation of the encounter. Yet when the flight attendant scanned Alexander's boarding pass and ushered him toward the first-class cabin, something unexpected happened. The attendant smiled warmly at Elena and waved her through as well, assuming she was with him. Alexander did not correct the mistake. Instead, he placed a steadying hand on her back and guided her forward, his touch light but firm, as though daring anyone to question it. Elena's protest died on her lips. She had never even walked past the velvet curtain into first class before. The plush leather seats, the spacious aisles, the hushed luxury felt like another world. Her carry-on looked embarrassingly out of place as she tucked it beneath the seat. Jason and his companion passed by on their way to business class, and Jason's face darkened when he saw her seated beside Alexander in the exclusive cabin. His girlfriend's eyebrows shot up in surprise before she muttered something that made Jason's jaw clench. Elena wanted to melt into the seat cushion, but Alexander leaned back with effortless calm, flipping open a magazine as though flying with her was the most natural thing in the world. The gesture was small, yet it sent a message Jason could not ignore. He belonged here, and by extension, so did she. Elena's heart hammered in her chest. She should have felt terrified, but instead she felt a strange exhilaration. For the first time in years, Jason's superiority had cracked, and it was because of this enigmatic stranger. The flight attendant offered champagne, and Elena shook her head quickly, murmuring that she could not possibly. Alexander accepted 2 glasses, setting one on the tray in front of her without comment. When she looked at him with wide eyes, he simply said, "You do not have to drink it, but you should not sit here acting like you do not belong." His tone was matter of fact, not unkind, but it struck her deeply. She had spent so much of her life apologizing for taking up space, for not being enough, and here was a man who insisted without words that she did belong. The plane took off engines, roaring city lights dwindling beneath them. Elena stared out the window, her reflection trembling against the glass. Alexander's presence beside her felt overwhelming, a constant reminder that the simple request she had whispered had set in motion something she could not control. She wanted to ask who he really was, but fear held her tongue. Instead, Jason answered the question for her, though not directly. An hour into the flight, Jason sauntered down the aisle, under the pretense of stretching his legs. He stopped near their row, resting a hand on the headrest in front of them, his smile dripping with false charm. "So Alexander Kane?" he said casually, pretending the name had only just occurred to him. "I thought I recognized you." Elena's breath caught her head snapping toward Alexander. The name meant nothing to her, but the way Jason said it carried weight, as though he had stumbled upon a revelation. Alexander's eyes flicked up cool and unbothered. Jason smirked clearly, relishing Elena's confusion. "Not much for publicity, are you? I guess that is why she never mentioned you." Alexander closed the magazine with deliberate calm and looked Jason squarely in the eye. "Perhaps she has better things to talk about than money." Jason flushed crimson, the jab landing deeper than he wanted to admit. He muttered something under his breath and stalked back to his seat, the brunette tugging at his arm with an exasperated sigh. Elena turned to Alexander, her lips parted in shock. "Who are you really?" she whispered. He regarded her for a long moment before answering. "Someone who prefers not to be defined by headlines." That was all he offered, and though it only deepened the mystery, Elena sensed it was not the time to press further. For the remainder of the flight, Jason's glares burned into her back, but Alexander's calm presence shielded her. She began to notice small details, the way flight attendants addressed him with an unusual respect, the way other passengers stole glances, the effortless authority in his posture. Whoever he was not ordinary, and being seen at his side meant the world would not view her as ordinary either. By the time the plane touched down, Elena's mind was a whirlwind of questions she could not yet voice. She only knew one thing with certainty. A single whispered request had thrown her life into a current she no longer controlled, and Alexander Kane was the storm at the center of it. The moment the wheels of the plane touched down, Elena's relief was short-lived, because as passengers began gathering their belongings, she noticed Jason lingering in the aisle, pretending to adjust his bag, while shooting barbed glances toward her row. She shrank back instinctively, but Alexander rose with measured ease, stepping slightly ahead of her as if to shield her from the unwanted attention. The simple gesture unraveled something in her chest, because no one had stood between her and Jason's cruelty before. As they exited the aircraft, Elena's mind replayed Jason's sneer from earlier, the words still sharp enough to sting. Still the same little nobody. She hated that she believed him, in part, because for years she had been treated as if she were invisible. Growing up, she had dreamed of teaching children, and she had fought tooth and nail through part-time jobs and endless nights of study to earn her degree. Jason had once laughed at her when she told him she wanted to inspire young minds. "Dreams do not pay bills," he had said. "You will never be more than average." And yet she had loved him, clung to the idea that beneath his arrogance he would one day see her worth. Instead, he had abandoned her for someone with wealth and connections, leaving her heart hollow and her faith in herself fractured. Now here he was again, wielding his contempt like a blade reopening wounds that had barely scarred. As Elena followed Alexander through the terminal, she whispered a quiet apology for dragging him into her drama. "You did not have to do that." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You asked me to," he said simply, as though that explained everything. They walked in silence until she dared to ask what Jason had meant on the plane. "He called you Alexander Kane." Alexander's jaw tightened briefly before he answered. "He enjoys the sound of names he thinks carry power." Elena tilted her head, confused. "You mean it is not true?" His eyes softened, but his voice remained steady. "I mean, power is only dangerous when people believe in it too much." She realized then that he had not denied the name, only the weight Jason had tried to give it. Before she could probe further, they reached the baggage claim, where cameras from gossip blogs were already snapping photos. Alexander's presence drew attention, whether he wanted it or not. Elena kept her gaze, low cheeks burning with embarrassment. She was nobody in worn jeans and a sweater, yet standing next to him made her a story people wanted to tell. As flashes erupted, she felt exposed, fragile. Alexander leaned closer, his voice low, meant only for her. "Do not let them see you flinch. That is what men like him want." The words struck a deep chord. She had spent years flinching, shrinking, apologizing. For once, she straightened her shoulders, though her hands still trembled. Later in the car that waited outside a sleek black sedan, she finally asked what she had been holding back. "Why did you really help me?" Alexander studied her reflection in the tinted window before replying. "Because I know what it feels like to be mocked by someone who once claimed to care." His confession was quiet, stripped of the armor she had seen him wear. Intrigued, she pressed gently. "Someone hurt you too." His gaze darkened as he nodded once. "I trusted a woman who saw me as nothing more than a stepping stone. When I refused to bend, she took what she could and left. The betrayal taught me more about loyalty than any business deal ever could." Elena listened, her heart aching at the raw truth beneath his composed exterior. She saw then not just a powerful stranger, but a man carrying invisible scars, much like her own. Their stories, though different, shared the same thread of betrayal and loss. The realization unsettled her, stirring something fragile but undeniable. That night, as she replayed the events in her mind, Jason's taunts still hurt, but they no longer defined her. Because for the first time, someone had stood beside her and seen her pain without dismissing it. On the following day, when she returned to the airport for a connecting flight, Jason appeared again in the lounge, his arrogance sharpened by jealousy. He tossed insults thinly veiled as jokes. Alexander met each one with calm, unshakable composure, shielding her from the cruelty. His presence became a wall she could lean against, and for the first time in years, Elena felt the faintest spark of courage. She told herself it was still a game, still pretend. But the warmth she felt when Alexander's hand brushed hers told another story. By the time their connecting flight landed, Elena believed she could slip quietly back into her ordinary life, but fate had other plans. Photos from the airport of Alexander's arm around her shoulders had already flooded social media overnight. Headlines screamed about the mysterious young woman traveling with the reclusive billionaire who almost never appeared in public. Mysterious teacher dating reclusive billionaire read one blog while another speculated she was an heiress in disguise. Elena's phone buzzed endlessly with messages from colleagues, students, and even distant relatives, all demanding answers she did not have. She sat in a cafe near the arrivals hall, her hands trembling around a paper cup of coffee, while Jason swaggered past the table with a smirk that cut deeper than any headline. "So this is how you move on," he sneered, latching onto money, "just like everyone said you would." His girlfriend laughed cruelly, and the sound made Elena's stomach twist. She wanted to shout that it was not true, that she had never asked for any of this, but her throat locked tight. Before she could crumble, Alexander appeared behind her, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through Jason's gloating. "Leave her alone." Jason bristled his bravado, faltering under Alexander's calm authority. For once, Jason had no clever retort, only a scowl as he stalked away, dragging his companion. Elena blinked up at Alexander, torn between gratitude and exhaustion. "You do not have to keep rescuing me," she whispered. His gray eyes searched hers with a steadiness that made her chest ache. "We do not have to pretend anymore," he said quietly. "But if you want, I will keep this up until they stop mocking you." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Elena knew she should end the charade, now walk away, before the rumors consumed her, but the memory of Jason's cruel laugh still burned like acid. If she walked away, she would confirm every insult he had ever hurled at her. With a deep breath, she nodded once. "Fine, we will keep pretending." Alexander inclined his head as if he had expected nothing less. The following days unfolded like a dream she could not wake from. Paparazzi followed them, snapping photos of casual moments that looked intimate through the lens. A simple coffee shared at a quiet cafe turned into a headline about the billionaire's new romance. Elena blushed at the whispers around her at school, where colleagues stared with envy or suspicion. Yet in the midst of the chaos, Alexander remained unflinchingly steady. He escorted her with a protective arm at public events, answering invasive questions with poised deflections. To outsiders, it looked effortless, but Elena felt the strain in every heartbeat. What began as a desperate act of survival had spiraled into something far larger, than either of them had intended. And somewhere between the staged smiles and whispered reassurances, she felt her guard begin to crack. Each time Alexander looked at her with that quiet intensity, she wondered if he, too, felt the line between pretending and reality blur. One evening, after dodging another wave of reporters, they slipped into a quiet restaurant, tucked away from the frenzy. Candlelight flickered across polished wood, and soft piano music drifted through the air. Elena stared at the menu, but her mind spun with doubts. "This is insane," she whispered more to herself than to him. "I am just a teacher. You are—" She trailed off, unable to define what he was to her. Alexander set his glass down, his gaze never wavering. "You are not just anything," he said. "Do not let anyone, including me, convince you otherwise." The sincerity in his voice broke something inside her. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a failure, not as a nobody, but as a woman whose worth could not be mocked away. The performance had begun as a shield against humiliation, but now as she sat across from him, Elena felt the terrifying truth settle in her chest. Somewhere in the shadows, between lies and headlines, her heart had started to believe the act. And judging by the way Alexander's eyes lingered on her, she suspected his had too. The illusion of control shattered quickly as Jason's humiliation at the airport curdled into vindictive obsession. He had always thrived on feeling superior, and now the sight of Elena by Alexander's side gnawed at him like a festering wound. Within days, he began making calls to acquaintances in business circles, probing for information about the mysterious man who had so effortlessly dismantled his pride. When the truth surfaced, Jason nearly choked on it. Alexander Kane was not merely a wealthy executive, but the reclusive billionaire whose quiet dominance of the airline industry had reshaped global travel. His influence extended into boardrooms Jason could only dream of entering. The revelation both enraged and terrified him. That night, Jason crafted his attack with malicious precision. He began whispering into the ears of anyone who would listen, painting Elena as a manipulative opportunist who had ensnared Alexander for his fortune. "She is just a gold digger," he sneered at a former colleague, who then repeated the claim to others. Soon the rumor slithered through the city like smoke impossible to contain. Elena first noticed it when she walked into the teacher's lounge at school, and conversations abruptly died. Colleagues who once smiled at her now exchanged wary glances. A fellow teacher muttered under her breath that some people would do anything to climb. Elena's chest tightened as shame flooded her. She wanted to scream that it was not true, that she had never asked for any of this, but the words stuck like stones in her throat. At dinner that evening, she confronted Alexander, her hands shaking as she clutched her glass of water. "They are saying I am using you," she whispered, her voice breaking. He studied her with a gaze that seemed to pierce through layers of fear. "Are you?" The question was not cruel but pointed, forcing her to confront her own uncertainty. Her lips parted in shock. "Of course not. I never wanted any of this." He nodded slowly, but offered no reassurance, and the silence between them was louder than any accusation. Elena left the table with tears blurring her vision, wondering if even he doubted her sincerity. Days later, the situation worsened. Jason arranged for a journalist hungry for scandal to publish a speculative article about Elena's sudden connection to Alexander. The headline screamed about a teacher from nowhere seducing a billionaire. The article dredged up her modest background, twisting her struggles into evidence of desperation. Elena sat on her narrow bed, reading the words over and over until they blurred. Every sacrifice she had made, every hour of honest work, was being rewritten as manipulation. The next morning, whispers followed her into the classroom. Some parents demanded meetings, questioning whether she was a suitable role model. The principal summoned her with a strained smile, explaining that until the rumors cleared, she should consider taking unpaid leave. Elena walked home under gray skies, her heart hollow. At the same time, Alexander faced his own crucible. Advisors urged him to distance himself from her, citing potential risks to his reputation and business. He stood in his office, overlooking the city lights, replaying Elena's trembling voice in his mind. He remembered the raw humiliation in her eyes when Jason mocked her, and the desperate courage it took for her to whisper that plea. "Pretend to hug me, please." The memory cut deeper than he expected. He realized that by staying silent now, he was allowing the same cruelty to consume her again. Yet his instincts as a businessman urged caution. He had survived betrayals and hostile takeovers by trusting no one completely. Could he truly believe in her? That night, Alexander walked through his mansion, filled with priceless art and empty halls, and felt the weight of his loneliness more acutely than ever. Power had insulated him, but it had not protected him from the ache of distrust. Elena, meanwhile, curled on her couch, staring at her phone as messages from former friends arrived, laced with pity or scorn. She whispered to herself in the dark, "I am not a liar, I am not what they say." But the words dissolved into the silence. She thought of ending the charade, telling the world it had all been a mistake. But she knew Jason would savor her downfall. And so she clung to the thin thread of hope that somehow Alexander might see through the fog of lies. For both of them, the line between pretending and reality grew sharper and more dangerous. The charade meant to shield Elena from humiliation had become a battlefield where her dignity and his trust were at stake. The next week unfolded like a surreal dream as Elena found herself stepping across thresholds she never imagined. Alexander invited her to a dinner that at first seemed like another attempt to shield her from the storm of rumors. But when she arrived, she discovered it was held in his private residence, a sprawling glass and stone mansion perched on a hill overlooking the city. The car that collected her wound through gates manned by discreet security, and the sheer scale of the property made her breath catch. Inside, marble floors gleamed under warm lighting, and walls bore abstract paintings that probably cost more than she earned in a decade. She followed Alexander through corridors that seemed endless, her worn shoes squeaking slightly against polished stone. She felt out of place, a trespasser in a world designed for people who belonged to a higher echelon. Yet Alexander moved beside her with unassuming calm, as if he had forgotten he was a man of staggering influence. He showed her a library lined with shelves of books in multiple languages, a study filled with models of aircraft, and a dining hall where a table set for two looked strangely intimate against the cavernous space. As she took it all in, she realized she was being given a glimpse into his hidden world, a world shielded from the glare of cameras and speculation. Over dinner, a simple but elegant meal prepared by staff, who vanished silently after serving, she dared to ask him why he had chosen to live this way, away from the spotlight. His gaze lingered on the view of the city below before he answered. Fame is noise. I prefer control." The statement was simple, yet it carried the weight of his philosophy. Elena saw in him a man who commanded empires, yet chose invisibility, a man who had everything except trust. She asked him about the models in his study, and his eyes softened for the first time as he described designing planes as a child, sketching wings in the margins of his notebooks, dreaming of conquering the skies. It struck her then that beneath the armor of wealth and power was still a boy who had wanted to create rather than dominate. The evening stretched, and she grew bolder with questions. "Why help me, really?" He met her gaze with disarming honesty. "Because when Jason looked at you, I saw the same look I once saw in someone's eyes when they wanted me broken. I could not watch it happen again." The confession silenced her, leaving her heart trembling with the knowledge that his wounds mirrored her own. Later, as he walked her to the car, she noticed the loneliness clinging to him, even in this palace of glass. His life was a fortress, beautiful, but isolating, and for reasons she could not yet name, she wanted to reach through those walls. In the days that followed, she was reluctantly pulled deeper into his orbit. Reporters hounded them, but Alexander's calm refusal to comment only fueled speculation. He insisted she accompany him to a corporate event so that the narrative could not be twisted further. When she stepped into the grand ballroom on his arm, the world seemed to pause. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over gowns and tuxedos, and conversations faltered as people recognized the elusive Alexander Kane with a woman none of them knew. Elena's heart pounded, but Alexander leaned down just enough for his words to brush her ear. "Walk as if you belong here, because you do." The affirmation steadied her legs and she lifted her chin. Throughout the evening, he introduced her not as a convenient companion, but as someone whose opinion mattered, steering conversations toward her profession, drawing out her insights about education. It left her dizzy, this subtle elevation, because never before had anyone placed her on equal footing in a room filled with power. Yet even amid the glittering smiles, she sensed the shadows. Whispers curled like smoke around the edges of the room. Jason's lies had reached these circles too, and she caught snippets of speculation, questioning her motives. The sting was sharp, but Alexander's steady hand at the small of her back anchored her. On the ride home, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, she murmured that she did not belong in his world. He turned to her, eyes steady in the dim glow of the car. "All of this means nothing if I cannot share it with someone real." That was the moment she understood the depth of his solitude. A solitude wealth could never cure. She did not know if she could bridge the chasm between them, but she knew with startling clarity that she wanted to try. The calm they had built around themselves collapsed when Jason struck his hardest blow yet. Furious that Elena had slipped beyond his control, he reached out to a rival conglomerate in the airline industry, men eager to wound Alexander by any means available. Together, they engineered a story designed to ruin her. Within days, headlines flared across every major outlet. Teacher manipulates billionaire for power. Photos of Elena at Alexander's side were twisted into evidence of calculated seduction. Her modest past reframed as a history of ambition and greed. The gossip machine painted her as a schemer who had orchestrated everything from the airport hug to the gala appearances. At school, the fallout was immediate. Parents flooded the principal's office, demanding that their children not be taught by a woman, they now believed to be corrupt. Students whispered cruel versions of what they had overheard at home. Her fellow teachers, who once admired her dedication, now looked away when she entered the room. By the end of the week, she was asked to take indefinite leave until the scandal quieted. The words crushed her spirit, each syllable tearing another piece of her identity. She walked home under gray skies, the sound of traffic muffled by the pounding of her heart. In her apartment, the silence was unbearable. She tried to read, but the words blurred. She tried to call a friend, but none answered. The world she had built on honesty and quiet determination was collapsing around her. Meanwhile, Alexander faced pressure of his own. Shareholders demanded answers. Advisors urged him to distance himself from Elena, warning that continuing to stand by her could destabilize delicate negotiations. He listened, but his mind refused to let go of the image of Elena's eyes wide with fear, yet filled with stubborn courage. He had seen the cost of betrayal before, but never had he witnessed innocence being weaponized against someone so undeserving. The choice tore at him. If he cut ties with her, he could preserve his empire, but the thought left him hollow. One evening, Elena sat in darkness, her phone buzzing with yet another message, filled with insults and threats. She deleted it with trembling hands, then curled into herself, whispering that she was not who they said she was. But the louder the world shouted, the harder it was to believe her own voice. A knock startled her. She opened the door to find Alexander standing there, his expression unreadable. For a moment she thought he had come to end the charade. Instead, he stepped inside his presence, filling the small apartment. He looked around at the modest space, with books stacked on the table and a worn blanket draped over the couch. Then his gaze returned to her. "You are paying the price for my silence," he said quietly. Her throat tightened. "I asked for this," she whispered. "I dragged you into it." His jaw clenched. "No, you asked for a moment of dignity. That should never have become ammunition for cruelty." They stood facing each other in the dim light, the distance between them charged with pain and something deeper. She wanted to ask him to make it stop, but she knew even his wealth and power could not erase the lies once they had taken root. All she could do was survive them. Jason, meanwhile, reveled in the chaos. He leaked doctored documents hinting at secret bank transfers tied to Elena evidence manufactured with surgical precision by Alexander's rivals. The public devoured the narrative, and soon the story shifted from gossip to outrage. Demonstrators picketed outside Alexander's headquarters, demanding transparency. Reporters camped at Elena's doorstep. She stopped answering the door, her meals left outside by delivery services. Every headline felt like another stone hurled against her fragile defenses. Then came the final blow. The school board issued a statement announcing her suspension pending investigation. Her career, the vocation she had fought for, with every ounce of her spirit, was gone in an instant. That night she broke. She sat on the floor, clutching the envelope from the board, tears soaking the paper, whispering that she had nothing left. It was in that hollow moment Alexander returned, his face etched with exhaustion, but his eyes burning with determination. "I will not let them destroy you," he said, his voice carrying a resolve that startled her. She shook her head bitterly. "They already have." He knelt before her, his hand brushing hers gently. "Not while I am still standing." She looked into his eyes and for the first time saw not just a powerful man, but someone stripped raw, someone who carried her pain as if it were his own. And though the storm outside still raged, she felt a flicker of hope ignite in her chest. Alexander realized the only way to stop the spiral was to step into the fire himself. For years he had avoided publicity, preferring to pull the strings of his empire from the shadows. But watching Elena be torn apart for the crime of showing him kindness awakened something fierce inside him. He summoned his communications team, ignored their nervous protests, and scheduled a press conference. When the day arrived, cameras filled the room, reporters whispering in anticipation. Elena watched from the sidelines, her body tense, her heart pounding with dread. She feared he might distance himself from her publicly to save his empire. Yet when Alexander approached the podium, his gaze searched the crowd until it found hers and held steady. His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable steel. "You have heard the rumors," he began. "You have read the headlines about manipulation and deceit. But the truth is much simpler. She never pretended with me. I am the one who begged her to stay." A murmur rippled through the audience as flashes erupted. Alexander continued. "I asked her to stand by my side because for the first time in years, I met someone who saw me as more than a name or a fortune. She gave me honesty when I had forgotten what it felt like. If there is fault, it is mine for drawing her into this storm." Elena's vision blurred with tears, her knees weak. In those few sentences, he had dismantled the entire narrative crafted to destroy her. Jason, who had slithered into the back of the room, paled as whispers began turning against him. Journalists who once hungrily repeated his rumors now sniffed at the scent of a different story betrayal by a jealous ex-lover. Within hours, investigative reports began to surface, connecting Jason to leaked documents, inconsistencies, unraveling the carefully fabricated lies. His smirk vanished, replaced by frantic denial, but the damage was done. The tide had turned. Elena felt the weight lift from her shoulders, though scars of humiliation remained. After the conference, she found Alexander in the quiet of his office. His tie-loosened exhaustion etched in the lines of his face. "Why would you risk everything for me?" she whispered, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what he had done. He turned to her, his expression stripped bare of defenses. "Because I could not watch them break you, not you." The words struck deeper than any declaration of love she had ever imagined, because they carried truth carved from sacrifice. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as it brushed against his. For the first time since the nightmare began, she allowed herself to believe that she was not alone, that someone truly saw her. His touch tightened, drawing her nearer, until the space between them vanished. The kiss that followed was not one of pretense or performance, but of two people who had endured humiliation, betrayal, and fear, and still found each other standing. It was raw and desperate, but it was also real. That night they did not speak much of Jason or the headlines or the uncertainty of tomorrow. They spoke only in the language of glances and whispered truths each moment, dismantling the barrier between pretending and reality. Elena lay awake afterward, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, marveling at how a single impulsive plea at the airport had carried her here to this moment. She knew storms still lay ahead, that Jason would not surrender quietly, but she no longer trembled at the thought. Because when Alexander had stood before the world and chosen her, he had given her something Jason could never take away. he had given her dignity restored and love made real. The weeks that followed felt like waking from a nightmare into a fragile dawn. Investigations into the fabricated evidence revealed Jason's collusion with Alexander's rivals, and the scandal shifted entirely away from Elena. Public sympathy swung in her favor as the truth spread that she had been a victim of malicious lies. Parents who had once demanded her suspension now sent letters of apology, and colleagues who had avoided her gaze returned with tentative smiles. Yet Elena did not rush back to her classroom. The wounds of betrayal ran deep, and she needed to rediscover her strength on her own terms. Alexander respected her distance, never pressuring her, but quietly placing resources at her disposal. One morning he handed her a document, a proposal for a scholarship fund, in her name to support children from underprivileged backgrounds. "I want you to decide how it runs," he said simply. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized he was not offering her charity but entrusting her with purpose. Together they launched the program, and for the first time, Elena felt she was shaping something larger than herself. At the public unveiling, reporters expected Alexander to take center stage, but he stepped back and allowed Elena to deliver the speech. Standing before an audience of educators and community leaders, she spoke with a voice steady and clear. "I was told once that I was invisible, that my dreams were too small to matter. But I have learned that dignity is not measured by wealth or status. It is measured by courage to stand even when others try to silence you." The room erupted in applause, not because she was connected to a billionaire, but because her words rang with authenticity. Afterward, Alexander found her backstage pride softening his normally guarded features. "You belong in this spotlight more than I ever will," he said, and for the first time she believed it. Months passed, and the bond between them deepened, no longer a performance, but a quiet partnership built on resilience and trust. Alexander remained a figure of mystery to the world, but to Elena, he was no longer the untouchable mogul whispered about in boardrooms. He was the man who had held her when she was breaking, who had chosen truth over convenience, who saw her not as a liability, but as an equal. Their love did not erase the scars, but it transformed them into proof of survival. Exactly 1 year after that fateful day at the airport, they returned together to board another flight. Cameras still followed them, though the frenzy had lessened, and whispers still rose wherever they went. As they waited at the gate, Elena leaned toward him, her lips curving with mischief. "Pretend to hug me again," she whispered, echoing the words that had bound them together. Alexander's mouth curved into the rare smile that reached his gray eyes. No pretending, not ever again. He pulled her into his arms without hesitation, and for once she did not feel the sting of curious glances or flashing cameras. She felt only the solidity of his embrace, the certainty that what had begun as a desperate shield against humiliation had become a love capable of weathering storms. In that moment, the noise of the terminal faded the past with all its cruelty dissolved, and the future stretched open like a horizon waiting to be claimed. Together they stepped forward, not as a billionaire and a teacher, not as a scandal and a story, but as two souls who had found each other in the unlikeliest of places and chosen to build something real. And for Elena, that was the miracle she had never dared to dream, that a whispered plea for a pretend hug would become the foundation of a life rewritten by love,